I'm Steve Zipperstein from the History Department in Jewish Studies. I want to welcome all of you here, and I'll speak just for a few moments about the series that this initiates. The series was inspired largely by a realization on the part of the Jewish Studies faculty here at Stanford that Jews baffle. And recently they've even baffled someone of the subtlety of Ann Coulter. Despite the rise of Sheldon Adelson, Jews continue to live socioeconomically largely like Episcopalians and yet vote like African Americans. Though identified as a faith, one would be hard-pressed to identify any Israeli prime minister, perhaps with the exception of Menachem Begin, who attended synagogue outside of an electoral cycle, and though vocally preoccupied, especially in the last year or two, with the possible rise of anti-Semitism, a large slice of this community threw itself into a battle against the foreign policy of a standing president, unlike any perhaps since the fight against the League of Nations under Wilson. And so understandably, this community baffles many of us, it baffles others. It was the subject of considerable discussion in one way or another on the Stanford campus and of course nationally. And it seemed to us that it might be useful to have a series of speakers, leading experts on American Jewish life, who by and large would be in conversation with faculty in ethnic studies at Stanford, and basically to try to explicate the otherwise inexplicable. And we're starting with Shaul Magid, a very great and very distinguished student of Judaism, both medieval, late medieval, as well as modern, who's written extensively, especially recently, about American Jewish life. I worked on this together very closely with Charlotte von Weber, the director of Jewish Studies, and Ari Kelman, my colleague from the School of Education. And the series is meant, obviously, to illuminate, not to comfort. That's not our role at the university, even if on occasion some things we say might be deemed comfortable. And we've invited for the first speaker a person who's both provocative and a great authority. And with that, I turn the podium over to Charlotte, who will moderate the program. Charlotte.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm Charlotte von Robert, the current director of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, since there are two former directors. And by way of introduction, I want to acknowledge a couple of people before I introduce both our main speaker and his conversation partner, which is first and foremost our staff. Linda Wynn, the office manager, who has run the office solo during the summer, and Nicole Bridges, who is a new addition. And Nicole is somewhere in the room, in the back. So thank you, both of you, for making the catering possible. But more importantly, I also want to acknowledge Mariam, who is sitting there, the associate director of the Center for the Comparative Study of Race, Ethnicity, who is a partner in this thesis. So we have actually collaborated between the two centers, and also got a lot of some support from you. So thank you. But now I want to introduce Shaul Magid. I'm so happy to be able to reintroduce to some of you my friend and colleague, Shaul Magid. He has been, I think it's done for twice already. Is that? And all of us on the committee thought that for the series, thought that Shaul was the perfect person to open the series. Shaul is not only the Schottenstein Chair of Jewish Studies and Modern Jewish Studies at Indiana University, and an elected member and leading academic scholar of Jewish studies. He is also one of the leading public Jewish intellectuals in the US, with essays in a variety of journals that many of you in this room read regularly, whether that's Tikkun magazine, Tablet magazine, Zeek magazine, Religion Dispatches, Open Zion, and so on. I'm not going to name you all the articles, since then we would be here for the rest of the day. But I also want to point out that Shaul has a wonderful blog online, Radical Banjo, which I love the title. So there you find a lot about his biography and autobiography and various commentaries on contemporary American Jewish life. One thing I want to point out, and that in a way both our speakers today share, is Shaul first. Shaul in a certain way has run the gamut of contemporary Yiddishkeit, I want to say. We're starting being a Baal Tshuva in the 70s, becoming a Baal Tshuva in the 70s, studying with Hasidic rabbis, and being a disciple of sorts of Shlomo Carlebach and Zalman Schachter Shlomi, and living also in Israel as he studied Chassidut. And then, I guess I can mention that, since you put that in your blog, leaving Orthodoxy, also in very public ways. So knows all these various aspects of contemporary American Jewish life from the inside, as he also is a scholar thereof. So he is at the intersection of the deep involvement in contemporary American Jewish life and being a student and scholar thereof and a critical thinker thereof. And I want to introduce briefly Amir Escher, my colleague and friend, who is in the German department and the comparative literature department. He is the here I have it in front of me, the title, Edward Clark Rossett Professor of Humanistic Studies. Amir is a scholar, as most of you in this room know, is a scholar of German Jewish literature and Hebrew literature, contemporary Jewish literature, scholar of many books, author of many books also that are published both in Hebrew and, in English and German, as well as in Hebrew. And I will just point out that Amir also bridges many aspects of contemporary Jewish life, having grown up in Israel and then gotten doing his graduate work in Germany, and then becoming a scholar and academic teacher here in the U.S. at Stanford. So he's has bridged these various scenes of Jewish cultural life as well. So I'm very grateful to Amir to having agreed to be the first conversation partner to our first speaker, and he will help us start the conversation at the end of the lecture. So with that, I hand it over to Shaul, so please help me.
Thank you, Charlotta and Steve, for inviting me, and for all of you for coming. And I want to begin by saying two things. First, some of my thinking on this particular question comes from a book project that's actually in process, co-edited by Ari Kelman. And there was a conference last year at Brandeis University that I participated in about Jewish identity, and some of these thoughts really came from conversations I had with Ari and with his co-editor Josh, and also in terms of thinking about my contribution to that. The second, more personal thing is that today happens to be the 20th yahrzeit of my father, and therefore I just want to dedicate this lecture to him. My father and his father were members of the Workmen's Circle. They were Jewish socialists. So they didn't really have much to say about Zionism. But in any event, I think he would have enjoyed these words. So, in the past decade, there's been increased attention on the vexing questions of Jewish identity among American Jews. And if people can't hear me, just call out and I'll speak louder. The 2013 Pew Research Survey of the United States Jews, as well as other studies, are indications that American Jewry is in a significant state of transition. The ostensible twin towers of Jewish identity in the past half century, the Holocaust and Israel, are no longer stable anchors the way they once were. The Holocaust is inevitably moving from a lived reality of witnesses to an event in Jewish history. And for anyone under the age of 45, Israel is a much more complicated place than it was for a previous generation. For many young American Jews, the nostalgia and romanticism that is depicted, for example, in Otto Preminger's 1962 film version of Leon Uris's novel Exodus, many of us know that film and have seen it many times. For many young American Jews, that film no longer resonates. This is all to say that the question of Jewish identity in America is indeed an important topic for scholarly consideration, which is why I think this lecture series is so important. But the very notion of identity itself requires some clarification. What do we actually mean by the term identity or Jewish identity? When did it become an operative term for American Jews? How does identity function in a minority community that is largely accepted in the majority society in which it lives? Does identity function as a way of drawing boundaries between insiders, American Jews, and outsiders, the larger American public? Does identity serve to draw boundaries between who is inside and who is outside the American Jewish community? American Jews today live in an ostensibly pluralistic community largely of their own creation, a community that acknowledges and accommodates difference on many levels of Jewish existence. But those differences also must have boundaries. What are those boundaries and who gets to decide? Where does authority lie in a pluralistic community? Here the question as to the relationship between Jewish identity and Jewish discourse is pertinent. That is, between markers of inside and outside versus boundaries of what is considered part of the legitimate Jewish conversation in America. Below, what I want to do is examine and critique what I consider to be a phenomenon in contemporary American Jewish life that I call the dogmatization of Zionism. Zionism has, of course, been a part of the American Jewish discourse for many, many decades. American Jews debated about it, they embraced it, some resisted it, and in many cases, at least until the early 1970s, some rejected it. Until the 1930s, Zionism was not supported by the majority of American Jews. And until the Biltmore platform in May of 1942, even most American Zionists were not statists. That means that their Zionism was not primarily about the support of the establishment of a Jewish state. Zionism was always one among various alternatives of a Jewish identity in America. I suggest that today the Jewish discourse about Zionism has become Jewish identity itself. Zionism defines Jewish legitimacy and is no longer simply part of the larger conversation. Rather, it has become the very boundaries of the conversation. I'm less concerned here about how and why this has happened, and more interested in asking whether Zionist hegemony is healthy for American Jewry. My constructive suggestion is that creating a Jewish space, or perhaps better put, reviving a Jewish discourse that is outside Zionism's hegemony, may be an important part of reconsidering the boundaries and possibilities of Jewish identity as we move further into the 21st century. That is, I suggest that we make Zionism part of a more multivalent and robust American discourse and not the very standards of that discourse. In her opening remarks at a session at the 2015 J Street Conference, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum noted that a Jew today can walk into any non-Orthodox synagogue in America and profess his or her atheism openly or lack of Jewish practice and be embraced and accepted. But if a Jew enters that same synagogue and professes to be an anti or even non-Zionist, he or she will likely be shown the door. While perhaps somewhat exaggerated for heuristic purposes, Kleinbaum's point is well taken. Lest I be misunderstood, I fully acknowledge Zionism as a viable and important part of Judaism in the diaspora. I don't mean in any way to undermine diaspora Zionism. Rather, I want to challenge its hegemony, to resist, even negate its ostensible totalizing nature, and argue for the creation of a diasporic post-Zionism. Not purely on ideological grounds, but also practical ones. The hegemony of one ideological position rarely serves to cultivate the health of a multivalent community. So to begin, how exactly did this happen? How did Zionism in America go from being part of the American Jewish discourse to policing American Jewish identity? In the early 1970s, referring to American Jews, Norman Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary magazine, wrote as follows: "We are all Zionists now," referring to American Jews. "We are all Zionists now." I think it was 1972. He was likely correct. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, the remnants of anti or even non-Zionism among American Jews, excluding the ultra-Orthodox, collapsed with the thunder of military victory and a new political reality. What was later to become known as the occupation was in the early 1970s considered by most American Jews and Jews worldwide as the liberation of lands that were tied to the Jews' biblical past and offered a security buffer against its enemy neighbors. The fear that this young country, the refuge of so many Holocaust survivors, was so quickly threatened with annihilation, and the exuberance and relief of Israel's ability to defend itself against that threat resulted in a collective sigh of relief and celebration of Jewish survival. But something else happened in 1967 that took a few years that I want to examine. Through no fault of its own, Israel became, in June 1967, a different country. It became the overlord of another people, whose claim of self-determination increasingly challenged their own. It took some years for the smoke of war to clear and reveal a new set of circumstances that would change the contours of American Jewish identity in response to the change of circumstances in the State of Israel. When a small cadre of American progressives in America in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War in 1973 initiated an organization called Brera to challenge the language of liberation and to call for an end to the occupation, they were summarily dismissed and forcefully shut down by the American Jewish establishment. What Brera was asking for was the radical notion of a two-state solution. By 1977, Brera was gone. American Jews could not see the dark side of liberation. The time was not yet right. The next 40 years saw the growth of a strong and vocal foundation of support for Israel in America, headed by the Zionist Organization of America, the American Jewish Committee, and later AIPAC. The latter was contentiously referred to as the Israel Lobby in the controversial book by that title by political scientists John Mersheimer and Stephen Wald, published in 2002. Wersheimer and Wald argue that Zionism, largely in the form of the Zionist and pro-Israel lobby group AIPAC, had become one of the most powerful ideological forces in American foreign policy, not just in American policy in relationship to Israel or the Middle East, but in American foreign policy, even in cases where it ostensibly was at odds with American self-interest. While one can certainly contest their conclusions regarding American foreign policy in Israel, I think it's safe to say that by 2002, Zionism did indeed become the dominant, almost exclusive form of American Jewish identity. The political and geopolitical implications notwithstanding, by the turn of the 21st century, American Jewish identity has become almost fused with Zionism. Below, I consider the implications of that hegemony. While Zionism is defined in many different ways, today mostly as supporting Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people, the term itself has become a marker that defines the boundaries of legitimacy in the American Jewish conversation. For obvious reasons, Israeli society has a much more vexed relationship with Zionism. Israelis generally know much more about the complex nature of Zionism, an ideology that was at war with itself for most of its existence, for anyone who reads the proceedings of the Zionist congresses in Basel, Switzerland. For many Israelis, Zionism is the Jewish ideology that founds their political existence. For American Jews, it is more often an identity defined by the support of a country they choose not to live in. There are those in Israel who are much more strident in their Zionism than most American Jews, and there are those in Israel who are much more ambivalent. And then there are those who often identify as post-Zionists, who are involved in constructing an Israeli identity outside the Zionist narrative. Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Kabbalah and lifelong Zionist, although Scholem's Zionism was quite complicated, was quite adamant that Zionism needs to be self-critical in order not to become hegemonic. In Scholem's view, Zionism needs to understand that Zionism contained contradictions at its very core, and thus needs constant reflection and re-examination, perhaps even revision. The sentiment was also shared by a lesser-known contemporary of Scholem in America, Simon Ravidovich, a professor at Brandeis University and lifelong Zionist who wrote a scathing critique of Zionist politics in the early 1950s called Arab Between Jew and Arab, that was concluded in his Hebrew magnum opus, Bavel v'Yerushalayim, that was published in 1957. Ravidovich writes, and I quote, "Is there any nation on the face of the earth that has the authority to admonish Israel? But Israel should admonish itself. The source of wisdom is morality. The first principle is that rule which governs the relationship between man and his neighbor." To some degree, Israel post-Zionism and also some forms of Israeli Zionism provide some of that self-criticism. Post-Zionism, therefore, is born from Zionism itself. The self-critical awareness has arguably not happened among most contemporary American Zionists today, except in some relatively small circles on the left. Although this was certainly not the case in earlier iterations of American Zionism. One could counter my claim of Zionist hegemony by saying that groups such as Jewish Voice for Peace, who support BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, they consider themselves to be some would say anti-Zionist, and yet they are free to express their views, which is true. But these groups are largely considered outside the Jewish mainstream and generally not invited into the American Jewish conversation. Non- or anti-Zionists have no real share in American Jewish discourse because it is Zionism that polices the boundaries of that discourse. Therefore, such groups as J Street have to constantly reiterate their Zionist bona fides. In America, there appears to be a vacuum between Zionism and anti-Zionism, between a Jewish identity where support of Israel occupies the center and a Jewish identity where it exists on the periphery or not at all. In short, there's not yet a space for a diasporic post-Zionism. This space would move Zionism from being American Jewish identity itself to reviving Jewish discourse that could include non- or post-Zionist alternatives. It would enable Zionism and American Jewish identity to be engaged in a relationship rather than the former being the very standard of the latter. So I begin with the working assumption that a society where one ideology, and I mean a community or a society where one ideology has hegemony over all others, where one ideology gets to define the terms of legitimacy, even if there may be good historical reasons why the state of affairs has transpired, opens itself up to the dangerous possibility of a kind of cultural totalitarianism, where dissent is considered a modern form of heresy. When the other, in our case, the non- or anti- or even post-Zionist, is considered the enemy of the Jews, and thus excluded largely by the means of the accusations of anti-Semitism or self-hating Jewness, it cannot function as a means toward revealing the weakness of one's own position. What I'm suggesting then is that an American post-Zionism is primarily about challenging the hegemony of the term as the litmus test for legitimacy. The creation of this space is true even for those who consider themselves anti-Zionists. So, for example, Daniel Boyarin, who does not consider himself a Zionist, writes as follows, and I quote, "Zionism is a particular reading of Jewish culture and especially of the Bible. I do not and could not, given my hermeneutical theories, say that it is a wrong reading or that is a right reading that can be counter to it. I do argue, however, that it is not the only reading." Can American Jewry cultivate a distinctive brand of American post-Zionism? And if so, what would it look like and how would it function? What I'm going to do is explore the beginnings of creating a critical space between Zionism and non-Zion and anti-Zionism through the reading of a series of essays by a settler rabbi named Menachem Fruman, who died in 2013, an eclectic and iconoclastic religious Zionist, and a student of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. It's here, I argue, deep within the recesses of a passionate and iconoclastic settler Zionism, where we perhaps can cultivate a space for an alternative model, a diasporic post-Zionism that could supply the self-criticism necessary for American Jewry's problem with Zionist hegemony. And there's one text that I want to base my reading on that you should have. I haven't gotten to it yet, but will in a moment. Before getting to Kook and Fruman, I want to give a kind of brief synoptic view of post-Zionism, because there may be people here that for the term are familiar with the term, but not really actually what it refers to. The term post-Zionism became part of the Israeli lexicon sometime in the 1980s, although it arguably had a prehistory that goes back to the mid-70s, when settlement in the occupied territories became government policy with the election of Menachem Begin in 1977. In the 1980s, a group of historians that became known as the New Historians, distinguishing themselves from the previous generation of historians of Israel who were largely part of what was called the 1948 generation, gained access to recently declassified IDF documents regarding the War of Independence in 1948, and began constructing a revised version of the establishment of the state and its relationship to the indigenous population known as Palestinians who lived there. In the English-speaking world, the most well-known of these historians is Benny Morris, whose book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem in 1947 to 1949, that was published in 1989, exposed the falsity of previous denials of mass deportations of Palestinian civilians and other abuses that resulted in, among other things, the Palestinian refugee problem. Books by other historians followed suit, but the real transition from the New Historians to post-Zionism likely accelerated in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords in 1994, when for the first time a two-state solution seemed possible. By 2000, Morris had recanted his position and rejected the label post-Zionist, and he published a revision of his book in 2004 called The Birth of the Palestinian Problem Revisited. He has since become a spokesman for what has become called the Israeli practical right, or pragmatic right. There are others, people like Tom Segev, whose book The Seventh Million was read widely in America, people like Baruch Kimmerling, Elon Pape, Gershon Shafir, Uri Ram, Avi Shlaim, Shlomo Sands, Tanya Reinhardt, Danielle Gavron, among many others. And I just kind of name drop here because for the most part, American Jews have no idea who these people are. Because most American Jews are not reading Israeli scholarship and are not listening to the Israeli media, even though some of these people publish in English. In short, Israeli post-Zionism is really not part of the American Jewish conversation at all. Perhaps this is because for most American Jews, Zionism really is about supporting Israel and its critics and answering its critics rather than an in-depth exploration of Israel's nationalistic origins and the complexity of those origins. For many American Jews, Israel is really about advocacy. They are arguably post-Israelists rather than Zionists, although they certainly identify as Zionists, and thus that identity should constitute a certain form of contemporary Zionism. In the diaspora, new forms of diasporism, which I think is the correlate to post-Zionism in a way, one could see that in the works of the Boyarin brothers, Judith Butler, Mark Ellis, Jacqueline Rose, and a number of other people. And of course, in the ultra-Orthodox community where it still functions in a very robust way. It's true that much of the discourse exists primarily among intellectuals and university professors and has not breached the walls of the Zionist mainstream that is still largely protected by the gatekeepers such as AIPAC, the ADL, and the American Jewish Community. These diasporists, anti-Zionists or post-Zionists, do not get airtime on news shows or other US media. But post-Zionism is really not about the diaspora or about American Jewish identity. It's about the myth of origins of the Israeli nation state. This may explain why American Jews are not interested in it. For the most part, post-Zionism has taken a secular form, that is, promoted by secular scholars and intellectuals who view Zionism as a secular Jewish ideology that's in need of significant revision. While this is arguably the case, hence the term neo-Zionism is used sometimes to describe settler ideology, distinguishing it from classical Zionism. There have been a few interesting, significant religious voices in Israel who have tried to make the case of what might be called a spiritual case for post-Zionism. And that's really what I want to talk about and then try to translate it into the American context. Below, I'm going to try to make a spiritual case for a decidedly diasporic post-Zionism that is founded on negation as a spiritual exercise, whereby the corruption of true religiosity, what Rev Kook called, and we'll see in the text in a moment, true faith, and what I call the secular dogma of Zionism in the diaspora, is countered by a post-Zionism that cracks the hegemony as the sine qua non of 20th century Jewish identity. To our two figures. Rabbi Menachem Fruman lived from 1945 until 2013. It's not very well known among diaspora Jews, although I should say there is a documentary that has just been finished and has been aired in Israel about Fruman's life. He was a highly visible and iconoclastic voice in Israel for the last 4 decades until he died at the age of 68. He was raised in a Zionist home in the Israeli town of Kfar Hasidim in northern Israel, spent many years as a close disciple of Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the son of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel. The elder Kook died in 1936 and didn't really see the establishment of the state and thus couldn't predict the challenges political sovereignty would present. His more militant son, Tzvi Yehuda, served as the dean of the Rav Kook Yeshiva until his death in 1982 and was the architect of the settler movement. Fruman was raised in the epicenter of the settler Zionist ideology. Yet, as in his tenure as the rabbi of Tekoa is a Jewish settlement on the West Bank, known among settlers and their supporters as Judea, Fruman developed a decidedly anti-militant worldview that was deeply committed to the idea that religion, instead of being that which made peace improbable, is precisely that which held the key to the solution to the conflict. A committed activist, Fruman professed openly that he was willing to meet with any religious leader, friend or foe. He subsequently met numerous times with Yasser Arafat of the PLO. He met with Sheikh Yassin of Hamas and many other leaders in the Palestinian community in an attempt to foster mutual understanding. But Fruman was not naive. He didn't believe that talking spirituality would melt away decades, perhaps centuries of hatred and acrimony. Rather, he believed that the realm of the spiritual, if it could be expansive rather than insular, if it could be inclusive rather than isolationist, was the best path to fostering human flourishing. That God talk could lead to respect for human dignity, and that the problem was not religion or politics, the problem was religion as politics. For Fruman, religion had the power to bring disparate people together, while politics usually served to divide them. It's noteworthy that Fruman remained to his last day a believer in the right of Jews to live anywhere in the land of Israel. In July 1996, he wrote the following, and I quote, "As a primitive religious Jew who was connected to the land that God gave my ancestors, I can attest. This is also the reason that the connection between those who support Greater Israel, Eretz Yisrael Shlema, and the Palestinians have far greater potential for success than those on the left. This is because the Palestinians are also generally a religious or have strong connections to tradition, to their people, to their land. What severs our connection is only hatred of the other." Fruman exhibits a kind of spiritual nativism that grew from his teacher Tzvi Yehuda, but arguably moves beyond him in that Fruman acknowledges and affirms the equally legitimate Arab connection to the land. One of his novel solutions, which may itself be a form of what one could call settler post-Zionism, was to distinguish between state and the Jewish attachment to the land. That is, Fruman suggested that in the creation of a Palestinian state, Jews should be able to remain in their homes and become citizens of the state of Palestine. And he said that he would be willing to be the first Jew who held a state of Palestine passport. While certainly impractical, even utopian, its mere mention cuts through the religious Zionist narrative as it has heretofore been presented by the Cookian school. More of a teacher and an activist than a writer, and more well known for the force of his personality and his prose, Fruman nonetheless published many essays, volumes of poetry in Israeli journals and newspapers. His essays have recently been collected and published in a slim volume called Sochakei Haaretz, Shalom Am Va'adama, which translates as Laugh, My Beloved People, Peace, People, and Land. The essays in this volume span the breadth of Fruman's interest from the crisis in religious Zionism to education, ecumenicism, politics, and secularism. Included in this volume is an essay called Placing Limits on Faith, which is the essay that you have in front of you, that was originally published in 1998. Fruman structures his remarks around a short and penetrating passage from Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook from his book Orot Emunah, The Lights of Faith, and then renders it applicable to his generation. Taking Fruman's lead, I will extend this reading of Kook as the basis for my spiritual case for post-Zionism in the diaspora. So the text is now in front of you, and I'm just going to read it, but please follow along, because it's a bit kind of opaque. Published in 1998, Placing Limits to Faith. In relation to the upcoming festival of Hanukkah, there's already been talk of comparing the natural, historical, and spiritual realms of the holiday. In terms of nature, the days are growing shorter and the light passes and is limited by increasing darkness. Historically, this was a time when Israelite culture was being diminished and limited by Greek culture. Nevertheless, the Israelites were able to overcome that challenge. Spiritually, Israelite faith was diminished by means of the influence of faithlessness, choser emunah, which really kind of means, it could be either faithlessness or the dominance of reason, of the Greeks. With these ideas in mind, I thought about citing a passage from Rav Kook's Orot Emunah and include some observations and comments of my own. So now this indented passage is from Rav Kook's writings that was probably written sometime in the 1920s in Palestine. Faith that extends beyond its measure brings destruction to the world. And this is not only regarding the faith in things that are false, but even true faith. When faith works on the individual and collective soul beyond its appropriate measure, it becomes diluted with other physical and spiritual forces. This then becomes destructive. Very kind of potent passage. The Rav, meaning Rav Kook, this is still Fruman's words, raises an issue here that should be surprising, especially when coming from the chief rabbi of Israel or of Palestine. He claims that faith, even true faith, when it extends beyond its limit, becomes destructive. What could he mean here? What's implied? Apparently, the Rav equates the experience of faith with mystical experience, when the individual or collective soul gets too caught up in divine perfection, that which is beyond cosmic perfection. This admixture destroys the individuality of the singular person. In this respect, it is a death force. Faith becomes a death force, or at least a force of confusion and destruction. Now, back to Kook again, the bottom of the page. For this reason, there are always those in the world that will rebel against faith, despite the inherent strength of faith, in order to bring the situation under control. This way, the world can receive the good faith, the good that is in faith, in proper measure. Now, Fruman continues. The drive to rebel against faith comes to ensnare the power of faith, so that it will not exceed its limits and cause destruction. The Rav envisions a positive role for these forces who ensnare faith. Through them, faith will contribute to the elevation of goodness in the world. It's precisely by means of this limiting power that the world can receive the goodness that faith has to offer. One more back to Kook. This is not the case only with faith. It's also true with wisdom, ethics, and all creative forces. When we see some positive phenomenon, there is also that which prevents it. From a narrow perspective, it means that this positive phenomenon helps the world, and that which prevents it does the opposite. But from a broader perspective, we see that both of these build the world, one through positive expression, the other through its negation. Fruman. Wisdom, ethics, and all forms of creative expression need to be limited. One cannot remain stuck in the narrow perspective by saying, for example, everything that limits ethics is destructive. It is precisely the limits to ethics, according to what the Rav says regarding faith, that enables the good in ethics to become operative. The power of the negation of wisdom and ethics and all other forms of creativity construct the world in the same way that the forces construct its values. The final generation, this is kind of an interesting turn here. The final generation of every epoch generally comes with the power of negation. No epoch is complete without utilizing the most refined dimensions of its spiritual influence. By means of this influence, it almost certainly extends beyond its limit. When we mark the end of an epoch, says Fruman, we can see certain spiritual forces reach the final stages of their power, and the spiritual force that was emblematic of that previous epoch extends beyond its measure. Therefore, the divine, he calls it Adon Hastoria, the master of history, which is a Hegelian term, comes to limit its power. The goodness that this force can bring cannot be absorbed by the world and turns to shatter it. Therefore, the last generation brings its measure, the generation that seals one epoch and begins another. Okay. Well, almost okay. The final generation of an epoch that comes to rebel against the emblematic spiritual movement that defines each epoch guards from the perspective of providence the reconciliation of the world, so that the spiritual movement will not be destructive. As soon as that negation is revealed, it exercises its strength to erase its measure. The weakness and nullity of that negation is revealed. Now, go to this last paragraph of the text. The Rav wrote these words, like what was Cook talking about? Cook was talking about secularism or apostasy, tenuat kfirah is the Hebrew term, of his time. What was the secularist hypocrisy, what was the secularist apostasy of Rev Cook's time? Zionism. Zionism was the negation of normative Judaism. His claim was that secularism, in the form of Zionism, had a positive function in that it served to prevent the overextension of faith. But in and of itself, it had no intrinsic value. In our time, says Fruman, I feel that it's possible to claim the same thing regarding different forces and creative impulses. Just as Cook saw his role not only to offer a correction between faith and the secular, but to offer a correlate wisdom to its limits, ethics to its limits, as well as other creative forces. I feel in our time, Fruman is writing this in 1998, I feel in our time, when Jewish nationalism that is being expressed through Zionism has also reached its limit. Its power needs to be contained so that it does not overextend its measure. But the required negation itself, without viewing its purpose as acting as a limiting force, loses its value. That's the text. That's Fruman's essay. So for those familiar with Rav Kook's writings, there's nothing really so radical here, because Rav Kook is precisely about trying to make the argument that secular Zionism, as the resistance and negation, as the tenuat kfirah, as the heretical move, is necessary in order to be able to prevent the overextension of faith of the traditional old settlement Jewish community that rejected Zionism. Cook takes it even one step further to argue that without these secularists, meaning without Zionism, a Jewish homeland could not have been built. His relationship to heresy is probably best captured in an oft-cited passage from his collected letters, where Cook writes, "A general principle in the war of ideas is that in regards to every idea that comes to destroy the Torah, we should not seek to destroy it, but build a castle of Torah on its foundations." This way of thinking also appears in the Kabbalistic literature with which was Cook familiar, which we won't necessarily go into. Negation does not imply preventing the object from overreaching its positive nature. It also, in due course, negation does not simply prevent an object from overreaching its productive nature. It also changes the object it negates. I want to stress that for Cook, negation is a spiritual exercise, and that its purpose is the continuation of the good and the prevention of evil, the proliferation of peace through negation, the work done to enable truth to remain good. at the very instant that truth can also express falsehood. In Cook's time, these carriers of true faith adhered to a strict rendering of the miraculous scope of exile and redemption, whereby human agency in regards to settling the land and political sovereignty could not be understood. That is, within the metaphysical and theological world of the Jewish community in which Cook lived, Zionism was impossible. It was theologically impossible. In Cook's mind, this stifled the divine progress of redemption that unfolded through this dialectical process. He also acknowledged that if we were just going to read classical sources, those sources would not be in Zionism's favor. Apostasy is generally not viewed as progress, except in heretical cases such as the Sabbatean movement and other movements within Jewish life. For Cook and for Frumin, the power of negation manifested as the secularists' negation of faith, that is, Zionism, for the sake of returning to the Jewish homeland, exposed how the truth was rendered false. The truth of tradition was rendered false by its overextension. Too much faith, that is, the anti-Zionism of the traditionalists, makes the true false, or at least prevents the true from producing the good. For Cook, then, without Zionism, tradition would not have maintained a status quo, but would have become a destructive force for the Jews in the world more generally. This claim is founded on Cook's idea that as historical epochs end, truth necessarily overreaches, becoming destructive, and thus arouses its negation. From a certain narrow view, what he calls mabat prati, from a narrow view of the past, the negation appears like it's false. But it is precisely in its capacity to negate that this force does its positive and redemptive work. In the summation of this reading of Cook, Frumin offers an updated version of Cook's dialectical formula as it relates to his own community. Regarding the crisis he witnessed in religious Zionism, Frumin writes as follows. And I think here contemporary events of 2015 become relevant. Frumin writes as follows, and I quote, "I feel that in our time," this is 1998, "I feel that in our time when Jewish nationalism that is being expressed through Zionism has also reached its limit, its power needs to be contained so that it does not overextend its measure." What exactly does he mean? Does he mean something close to what Avram Berg suggested in his famous 2003 London Guardian article, that this may be the last Zionist generation? Probably not. This was published in 1998, after Rabin's assassination, but before the Second Intifada. In fact, before the euphoria of Oslo had fully worn off. What is Frumin's evidence of Zionism having reached its limit? Frumin remained a believer in Greater Israel as a spiritual ideal, but not necessarily a political one. And he claims elsewhere that the operative question for his community is how to deal with human freedom. Human freedom and how to deal with it is for Frumin the essence of Zionism. The crisis of religious Zionism for him was not about history, but about human will. What will Zionists do with freedom? While one cannot know for sure, in other writings, Frumin stresses the choice of politics over culture, jingoism over humanism, and land over spirituality. As a movement that was intended to establish Jewish sovereignty and freedom, in Frumin's mind, Zionism in general and religious Zionism in particular has become a tool to control another people, thereby limiting their freedom and by extension making Zionism itself an emblem of unfreedom. In effect, according to Frumin, it was in danger of losing its moral foundations. In 1995, Frumin wrote an op-ed in the Israel Daily Haaretz that was called "The Right to Stand." And in that op-ed, he writes as follows. "In school, we were taught a formal principle that if a person wants to build his world as beautiful as it may be, by destroying the world of another, as impoverished as it may be, this is both the sin and its punishment. The lesson one learns from this is simple." I'm still quoting Frumin. "It is forbidden for Jews to build their return to Zion at the price of the Arabs. It is forbidden for settlers to build their settlements, even if they are beautiful and rooted in the midst of the destruction of the world of the Palestinians." End quote. This is coming from the rabbi of a Jewish settlement. Here and elsewhere, Fruman seems to echo sentiments of many in Brit Shalom and Yichud, two short-lived binational movements that comprise mostly German Jewish intellectuals for advocating a binational state. Can we say that for Fruman, Zionism as a tool or justification of oppression is its overextension, whereby a positive idea turns destructive not only for the oppressed, but also for the oppressor? So I want to take this and look at what we can get from this from our perspective. In today's Jewish diaspora, rather than viewing the hegemony of Zionism as an example, as its overextendedness, as Fruman seems to do, many view Zionism as a requirement of Jewish identity. While Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi famously claimed in his Zachor that in modernity history has become the religion of the fallen Jew, today Zionism has arguably become the civil religion of the American Jew. There's an old joke in America about 3-day Jews, Jews who attend synagogue the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and 1 day of Yom Kippur. I recently heard an LA version called 3-dinner Jews. Jews who go to the annual synagogue dinner, the Jewish Federation dinner, and the APEC dinner. Pro-Israelism has become an integral part of American Jewish civil religion. It has attained the status of culinary holiness. As a result, Zionism often functions not as part of Jewish identity, but as Jewish identity, sometimes as Jewishness itself, and as a litmus test that closes off all other alternatives. I suggest then that the overreaching of contemporary diaspora Zionism is its hegemonic control over public Jewish discourse. This operates in numerous ways. Perhaps on the most base level, it's the equation of non or even anti-Zionism, or even a deep critique of Israel with anti-Semitism, a sure way to prevent any serious consideration of its position. More subtly, but along similar lines, it's the innate suspicion that any non-Zionist position is an attempt to destroy the land of Israel. This is simply not the case. Now, this hegemony of Zionism is actually not new. In 1948, for example, Hannah Arendt wrote as follows, this is in 1948, "From the time of the Balfour Declaration, the loyal opposition in Zionist politics was constituted by the non-Zionists. But for all practical purposes, the non-Zionist opposition no longer exists. The unfortunate development was encouraged, if not caused, by the fact that the United States and the United Nations finally endorsed an extremist Jewish demand that non-Zionists had always held to be totally unrealistic. With the support of a Jewish state by the great powers, the non-Zionists believe themselves that they themselves had been refuted by reality." Okay, so in conclusion here, my suggestion of an American post-Zionism is not to deny Zionism, but to negate its hegemony in public discourse, in order to free some diaspora Jews from the Zionist affiliation, in order to encourage the development of new alternatives to Jewish life. Zionism usually functions as one of many Jewish alternatives. Cook and Fruman write about the negation in a metaphysical vein, but I'm looking at it more as a social critique. Therefore, I don't need to proclaim that the negation of Zionist hegemony has only instrumental value. If its value is implemented, it'll break open the hegemonic nature of Zionism and enable other forms of identity formation. As a result of subverting the hegemonic and totalizing nature of Zionism in the diaspora, this negation as resistance can then begin to articulate a vision of identity that is not subservient to the Zionist narrative of the negation of the exile, but will certainly leave room for Zionism in its many forms to continue to exist. What it will resist, or what I'm suggesting that we should consider resisting, is the totalizing nature of one form of Jewishness, while allowing Zionism to remain undeveloped. I think it'll also be healthy for Zionism because it will be released from the burden of all totalizing concepts. It will not have to be all things to all people. Both Fruman and Cook viewed resistance and negation as a spiritual exercise that served both a preventative and a constructive purpose for Zionism. Jews living in the diaspora can learn much from them. Not so much about the value or obligation to live in Israel, where diaspora Jews continue to choose not to live, but about the dignity and the importance of living spiritually engaged lives in the diaspora alongside, but not necessarily subservient to, the state of Israel. Thank you.
So I'd like to begin with a few words of thanks, namely first to Steve, to Charlotte, and to Ari for inviting me to offer some thoughts after Shaul's beautiful talk, for which I'm also very thankful. So besides being very thankful, I'm quite humbled because I know that in this room sit a lot of people with profound knowledge of history, Jewish history, world history, and I'm, merely a scholar of literature who's here in front of you, just offering a few general thoughts following Shaul's very deep and interesting presentation. So what I intend to do is not to give a paper following Shaul's paper, but rather some very general thoughts and perhaps questions following Shaul. And I'd like to begin maybe with two personal stories. The first coming from this week. I was on the phone with my father. He is an 81-year-old Holocaust survivor. I was very moved by your reference to your father, Shaul, because coming today to the talk, I thought about this conversation with my father, and I find it interesting that both of us begin with our fathers. And we spoke about what's going on today or this week, this last few weeks actually in Israel. And I sensed very clearly my father's deep discontent and mostly confusion. Confusion that's not just related to the fact that he's 81 years old, but confusion about trying to make sense of what we call in Hebrew Hamatzav. Everything was said about Hamatzav in the last few decades, and lo and behold, we are in 2015, and he just couldn't find the words to describe what he even thinks. There was a lot of silence in this conversation, and it ended really on a very sad note, because I had nothing to offer in terms of insight or hope or perspective. You go through the motions and you say, well, maybe things will get better, Father, let's hope, and so on. But I noticed that all these words are quite empty. So this is one personal story. The other personal story I'd like to share with you is from 2006. I was visiting Israel after another wave of, terrorist attacks, if we can call them that way, in reaction to those attacks, etc. And I was visiting a family of a friend of mine in Tel Aviv, and I was talking with my friend and his wife, and I was expressing my concern about Hamatzav, about the situation, and listed a whole list of problems and worries and security and terrorism and what the Israeli government is doing, etc., etc. And then my friend's wife looked at me and she smiled and she said, look, I don't know what will be here, what will be in this country, but I can tell you one thing for sure. I know that I will live here and my children will live here, and I know that we'll speak Hebrew. So in the general confusion that I'm describing here, my own confusion, my father's confusion, certainly my friend's confusion, what I can try to offer is a way to maybe think about confusion, and I think what you described, Shaul, is bafflement. I think Steve mentioned or used the word bafflement. I think this bafflement is shared both by American Jews, of whom I certainly don't know enough, but among Israelis for sure. I keep quite closely in touch with what's going on in Israel, and I can tell you that the bafflement I hear from you and from Steve and from many others is shared by many Israelis today. So I hear bafflement, and I hear an attempt to move beyond bafflement by suggesting that it's time to move to a post-Zionist condition, state of mind, way of thinking among American Jews. And I'd like to say that to a certain extent, I'm completely with you. I think that a certain way of thinking about Zionism and a certain attachment of Zionism to Jewish identity is all but passé, over, you know. You cannot hold on to it the way perhaps Jewish communities and individuals held on to it in the past. And I completely agree with you that holding on to the other pillar you mentioned, and I think very rightly so, the pillar of the Holocaust, is also very problematic, and I think for a variety of reasons, which I'm not going to talk about today, holding on to this as the second pillar is very problematic, and it's time to develop ways of thinking and talking a different kind of discourse around this profound historical experience, which continues to shape us all. Having said this, my first question to you, Shaul, and to us, and I'd like to phrase it really as a question because I certainly don't have a clear answer. My question is, when you say Zionism, and when you say post-Zionism, and when we say Zionism, post-Zionism, what do we actually mean by the term Zionism? What is Zionism? Now, I'm not going to hold here, a history seminar, and I don't suggest we move into this mode. What I would like to suggest is that from its inception, Zionism was always a plural. There were a variety, a multiplicity, a whole array of ways of thinking about a Jewish self-determination wherever it will take place. If it will take place in Uganda, or in Palestine, or elsewhere on the moon. And there was a hefty debate. I remember that from going to school in Israel. We learned those texts. There was a hefty debate among Jewish intellectuals all the way, late 19th century into the 20th century about this creature Zionism, and there were many, many different approaches to this concern. And the concern again is, and I think this is quite important, the concern is, what does it mean for Jews to be able to self-determine, to decide on the course of their history, to be agents of their fate, to not just be the receivers of decrees of kings and queens and parliaments and so on, but to actually participate in shaping their lives as a community, as a group, as a nation. So I think Zionism is a plural, and I think the fate of this plural is a question mark. A question mark. What will happen to this plural? Where is this conversation around this notion of Jewish self-determination? Where is it going? I don't have an answer. I'm sure that many of us sitting in this room don't have an answer. We're reading newspapers, we're reading books, we're talking to colleagues, to friends, to family. And I think that the bafflement, the confusion about this direction is general. I can say, and in this regard, I'd like to sort of out myself. I can say that my own hope is moving forward, or thinking about the future, or thinking about my family in Israel, thinking about my friends and my colleagues. My hope is that whatever happens between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, whatever shape this territory will have in the future, and I think the outcome of this shape is pretty much up in the air. I hope that the Jewish population living in this space between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean will have a clear and a viable say in shaping its future as a community. That is my hope. And in this respect, to a certain extent, I am a Zionist. I hope that Jews living in this territory will have a say in shaping their future. Not the only say, not an exclusive say, not a prescriptive say, not a totalitarian say, not a non-democratic say, but I do hope that they will have a say. So in the many shapes and colors, etc., of Zionism, I hope that this shape, this form of Zionism will sustain and maybe thrive. Shaul, you bring Fuhrman, and I think it's wonderful that you bring him, and I think it's wonderful that you bring this figure of negation, because I think negation is very important to this conversation. And I think that what Fuhrman symbolized and what he lived really in his own life and teaching and his writing is an idea similar to the idea I just expressed. Namely, he's willing to live in this territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean with a Palestinian passport, but he wants to have some kind of a say in shaping the future of himself and his family. And I think that he hopes that whatever shape this entity will have, at the end of the day, it will be an ethical entity. So ethics, I think, is another very important point that I take from your presentation and from your consideration. Now, I want to go back to what's happening in America, in Jewish communities, among us sitting here, in academia, when we talk among ourselves, when we talk to students, and so on. And I want to go back to your idea that we need a certain form of detachment, or what you call post-Zionism, and so on. So while I said in the beginning that I'm all in favor of farewell to a certain type of Zionism, hegemonial, prescriptive, not complex, ideological, a Yiddishkeit type of Zionism, I'll call it here, and I hope you understand what I mean by it, namely a Zionism based only in an unconditional identification with whatever the current government of Israel is doing, that type of Zionism. I hope that we will say goodbye to that type of Zionism. Or I hope that the critique on this type of Zionism will become louder, because I think it's unhealthy. I think it's unhealthy intellectually. I think it's unhealthy for the community. I think it's not viable for us thinking people, and I don't think it's viable for us ethically oriented people, just to agree and to go along with whatever the current Prime Minister of Israel happens to think is the right course of action. I strongly oppose this form of Zionism. However, what I do hope will not happen in American Jewish communities, and I live in this country, so I can speak also for myself, I hope that people will not detach themselves from thinking and expressing their opinion and participating in the conversation which takes place today in Israel and elsewhere about the fate of Jews living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. So just to make it clear, I hope that American Jews will not retreat from taking interest in what's happening, will not retreat from expressing their views, their concerns, their criticism, hopefully a lot of criticism, regarding the life of this great Jewish community. After all, Israel, among many other things, is the place where lots of Jews are living. And the fate of those Jews, I hope, will continue to be in the minds and hearts of us living in the United States. But I hope that this conversation will be open and critical and sometimes even, bold. And I hear you, I listen to your talk as a bold intervention in this conversation. I think it's a very welcome intervention, because without the participation of Jews living in America in this conversation about the fate of the Jewish community in what's called now the State of Israel, I think Israel's future is even darker than it is today. In other words, I'm saying now we because I still have my Israeli passport and my Israeli citizenship, so we need American Jews critical and informed and caring, because otherwise it will be much more difficult for us living in Israel, or those of us who live in Israel, to live a viable a Jewish ethical life. So yes, we need to rethink what Zionism is, and we need to remember Zionism is a plural, but I hope we will not detach ourselves and remove ourselves from the important conversation about the fate of this very special creature we call Zionism.
Thank you.
So we'd now like to open up the conversation, and I would give the students that come here the preference to start off the conversation, but it's generally an open conversation. So any comments to either one?
Yeah, I just have a question for you about why you feel like it's so important for American Jews to be so involved in the conversation, because I always feel like I don't live in Israel. It's not really my place to get involved in that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Let me ask you, when you read in the newspaper, if you're Jewish, I mean, I don't want to assume.
I am.
But you are. So when you as a Jewish person, when you wake up in the morning and you open the newspaper and you read that Jews either, say, just for the sake of argument, attacked Turks in Germany, or were attacked by Turks in Germany, do you care about what happened?
Yes.
So think of Israel as, a Jewish community, a place where lots of Jews live as a community, and what is done to them or what they do to others may or may not involve you, or you care about. So if you say, I don't care about what's happening with them, that's your decision. But I think that we Jews tend to care when we open the newspaper and read about Jewish communities around the world. We care about what Jews are going through or what Jews are doing to others. That's my... Yes.
It seems like there are two conversations. Amir, I would say, until you said, I'm going to come back now to the American Jewish community, I was thinking, well, Shaul started there, and then we kind of went over to the whole ideological framework of both Rob's Cook and Froman. But I want to veer us back to the American Jewish community, because I think the bafflement and Steve's comments at the beginning about this whole Iran deal, that was like a magnifying glass of it was kind of something that really showed us this separation of what's going on within the American Jewish community. And I'm curious, because it seems to me, I worked in the Federation for 15 years in San Francisco. And my experience there was everybody was a super Zionist. Zionism was, and I think it still is today, that you are if you're not pro-Israel, you're not inside. And you use that word, insider and outsider. But part of that came because there was nothing else. There was nothing else as romantic, as sexy, as compelling, as engaging. None of them were observant Jews in any way, spiritual, etc. So what I'm kind of reflecting on is they have missions to Israel, and they raise money for Israel, and Israel, but there was nothing else to come in and kind of replace it. So I'm wondering what you can talk about. And by the way, Israelis in the United States, some of whom are my family, my son and daughter-in-law, they also struggle with what are we replacing for the religion of Zionism? How do we Jew? What makes us a Jew?
Right. No. I think that in a certain sense is the question. I think what Jews of a generation of the baby boomers and before, and even to some Gen Xers, there was a certain kind of precarious but still comfortable coexistence between their liberalism and their Zionism. Right. And part of that was the Israel that we, just putting myself out there, I was born in 1958, so as a baby boomer, part of our experience of Israel was making the desert bloom and Otto Preming's movie and all of those kinds of things, the kibbutz movement and the utopianism and so on. For the millennial generation, it's a very different place. And many people, I think, of the baby boom generation, with the rise of neoconservatism in the 80s, and this is very important, there is a kind of, and partly I think the Prime Minister really put the wedge there on the Iran deal, making it saying, you have to choose. You're going to be a liberal or you're going to be a Zionist, or you're going to be pro-Israel. You can't be both anymore, right? And in a certain way, that was the real shot that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave to the American Jewish community. You have to make a choice. That was the partisanship of it. I think that because of the attachment to Israel of many of people of our previous generation, their choice was pro-Israel. And they were willing to throw their liberalism out. Or, as a Facebook friend of mine said in her political views, right on Israel, left on everything else. Right? That's how she described herself. And I think it's very common. The millennial generation are not willing to do that in the same way. Because the Israel that they grew up with was not that romantic country. Right? So I think that's why if you look at organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine or Jewish Voice for Peace or Jewish movements on the far left are much more, are made up of millennials. Whereas if you look at the average age of a person at an APEC conference, right, they're of a previous generation. So, you know, I think that's part of what's happening. You're right that there's nothing to take its place, but I think the reality of the situation, as complicated as it is, without going anywhere political, just as complicated and I think we can all agree it's messy, right? And the access that younger people have to social media and the access that they have to Al Jazeera and the access they have to various different news sources, they're just not choosing, they're not making the same choice their parents did. And I think that's causing a lot of anxiety. So I think, for me, diminishing the hegemony opens up the space to think about alternatives. We can't even think about alternatives yet. That's
thinking about what you said made me realize that what kind of language you use to describe the situation, Shaul, and I'm not arguing against your claims and description of the situation, but why say that Zionism is taking control? That Zionism is, the entire language used to describe it is really one that presents Zionism as something almost violent. It's, it's taking over, it's taking control, it's
policing.
It's policing. I listened to a lot of the words which don't really work with the Zionism that, my Zionism that's closer to Amir, but I can see it related to a different kind of perspective. And so we could have presented the same thing by saying that American communities embraced Zionism because there was a void, for example, which is part like what Necham said. Or I can think about other ways that Jewish Americans felt that after the Holocaust or years after the Holocaust, security became a major issue. And the kind of Zionism that they embraced was not necessarily a Zionism that had to do with the culture and the land and a lot of things that I grew up on, but actually one that focuses on security for the Jewish people. So there are lots of ways to describe the same situation, and my question is, why use these adjectives to...
That's a good question. I think that's a good question. I think that from my vantage point, I see, at least with, not so much with myself, but with students, that there is a certain kind of policing going on, that people, I'll just one anecdotal example. A student of mine who is a member of Students for Justice in Palestine, and she, posted some things on her Facebook page and had to basically shut down her Facebook page because she was bombarded with visceral attacks from Facebook friends, family, so on and so forth, just for posting an article, right? I think that the volume is very high now. It's very, very high. Not obviously on that side of the ocean, it's very, very high for all kinds of different reasons. But what I want to throw out as a suggestion, perhaps, is that for many American Jews, Zionism is really not about Israel. It's about American Jewish identity. It's not about that place over there. It's about how do I identify, how do I express my Jewishness? And I think that in a certain way, that raises the volume in some strange way, that raises the volume even higher, because if you're saying that that you're an anti-Zionist, you're kind of taking away my identity as an American Jew, because I've already given up on religion long ago, right? I mean, American Jews have given up on religion as the anchor of their identity. So in terms of the question that Nechama asked, what do I fill it with? So you fill it with, commemoration of the Holocaust. Outside of Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, commemoration of the Holocaust ceremonies in synagogues have the highest attendance, right? Tisha B'Av, nobody comes, right? But nobody comes. But Holocaust Day, it's packed. No, yeah, I mean, the Jews have suffered for thousands of years, and nobody comes.
But Yom Kippur,
well, that's a different question. Because anyway, so I just wanted to. I mean, it's a good question. I think maybe it's my own kind of reaction to also the way in which I give a course, for example, at IU called Jewish Critics of Zionism. Now, most of the people I read are Zionists. I read Gershom Scholem, I read Yeshayahu Leibovich, right? I read Martin Buber, right? And that course made it onto Campus Watch, which is a website that polices anti-Semitism among university professors. Just the blurb of the course, I hadn't even taught the course yet. It was just on the website. So I think there's a lot going on in terms of that policing that I think is generating that reaction. But I hear the critique. I accept it. Maybe other ways of saying it are better.
I'm going by my list here. Shoshana, and then Ari, or Nancy.
So I wanted to backtrack to something Amir brought up. You mentioned, you sort of framed it as a question, is what is Shaul referring to by Zionism and post-Zionism? And you mentioned that you grew up growing up in Israel, there were many strands of Zionism. And I guess I just wanted to bring back that question and, pose that to Shaul. Can you define what you mean when you say American?
Well, I'll give you, I'll answer with an anecdote, a short anecdote. My nephew, my sister has modern Orthodox and lives in Skokie, Illinois, and they sent their kids to Ida Crown, which is the modern Orthodox school in Illinois. And when he was a senior in high school, he had a few elective courses that he wanted to take. So you would think that among the electives they would have a course on the history of Zionism or the history of the State of Israel or something like that. The only elective course he could take was a course called Israel Advocacy. That was the course. It wasn't about Zionism.
This is in a modern Orthodox.
In the modern Orthodox day school, right? It wasn't about Zionism. It was about how do you actually answer on campus when you go to college the next year, right? You're senior in high school. How do you answer? Now, when I talked to him about some of the major ideas of Zionism and Zionist leaders, he knew nothing. He knew absolutely nothing. Outside of Theodor Herzl and David Ben-Gurion, he didn't know anything. But he knew all the talking points, right? And I think that you find that's actually quite common. So you're right. It's in Israel, your experience, Amir, and your experience, Vera, growing up in Israel, obviously very, very different, right? You can listen to Baruch Kimmerling or Ilan Pape or any of these people talk about things that are so far to the left of anything any American Jew thinks is on the left. And that's part of the conversation. They'll be on the news. Yitzhak Leor writes for Haaretz, right? I mean, these are people that would never be given any kind of forum in America. So what I'm talking about is, I would love it if actually more American Jews were actual Zionists, meaning that they actually studied what Zionism was about. But that study would actually undermine the very project of Israel advocacy, because they would be studying people who would be saying things from the perspective of Zionism that would be, from their perspective, anti-Semitic, not only anti-Zionist. So I think that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that we don't really have Zionist education.
Tell me if I got the Froman quote correct.
Yeah.
This is a question really for both of you. Negation distorts the object; it negates. Now,
Or changes the changes.
okay,
Yeah.
I'd like the word
Distort,
but
okay.
It's
yours, take it.
You'll see why so many, when speaking about Israel, speak a great deal about hatred toward Israel. You, to some extent, both of you, Amir alluded, you, in talking about Israel, spoke nothing about hatred. That hatred toward Israel has distorted, hence my preference.
Right.
The object that it distorts is undeniable.
Right.
That it exists is undeniable.
Right.
So once you factor that in, how does that, how do you move that into your intellectual broom closets? And how does it then perhaps move items around ever so slightly, or more than slightly?
Right.
Because it's not simply that Lahore or others don't get a say. It's much of what we're wrestling with is going on against the backdrop of an international political scenario, where arguably people far, far more extreme than Lahore get an extraordinary say.
Right.
And so what do you do with that?
Right.
I hear that. I mean, I think that is certainly true, and it has to be part of the conversation. I mean, part of the problem, as I see it, is that's the only conversation. That is the conversation, and I think that in some way, in my experience, for example, I don't think that the defense against that hatred does anything to diminish the hatred. But in my experience, and again, this is totally anecdotal, when I speak in front of Muslim American audiences and criticize Israeli policies, there's a certain kind of openness that happens, right? Because they're expecting something else. So, again, that's not the solution to the problem, but it may be part of a way of beginning to have an honest conversation about contested narratives by acknowledging the reality that the person that you're talking to is experiencing, even though they may be distorting that reality. I mean, they are distorting that reality. But nonetheless, by giving them their narrative, sometimes it allows a kind of openness to hear the narrative of the other. That's a purely kind of rhetorical device. But I think you're right. Again, I see that becomes the totality of the conversation. So that when you have a conversation about Israel and you criticize something that happened, you very often hear, they're trying to kill us, right? And at that point, there's no conversation anymore, right? There's nothing to say.
So I have young gentlemen in the blue shirt, Annie and Josh, and Elaine. And
As the young gentleman in the blue shirt, I just want to say thank you. It's been very thought-provoking, both intellectually and personally. You argue quite persuasively about this fusion of Jewish identity and the politics of a very narrowly defined Zionism. My question is that fusion in America the epitome of a fusion that's happening internationally, or is it something uniquely American? And if it is uniquely American, what accounts for that fusion here rather than in Melbourne or Johannesburg or Berlin?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think that it depends where. I think in certain countries, for example, in Great Britain and France, I think there are other kinds of issues that they're dealing with, a real kind of palpable anti-Semitism that American Jews simply are not dealing with. That's not only coming from the anti-Israel camp, but that emerges from a long European history, which I think creates a whole different set of parameters. There was an interestingly, in the news about 6 months ago, the Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a talk at a French synagogue after the murders, and after the talk, all of the audience in the synagogue rose up and spontaneously started singing the French national anthem. After he'd said to them, Israel is the only place to go, you should all come to move to Israel, right? They got up, you can see it on YouTube, they got up and started to sing the French national anthem, right? So I think that even though they're experiencing a real sense of anti-Semitism, I think that they interestingly have a sense of being French in a way that many American Jews don't have, right? I always tell my students, they used to, I don't know if it's anymore, but years ago, there was a bumper sticker called, that said, I love New York, but Jerusalem is my home. Something like that, right? So it's an interesting bumper sticker to go around, because if you stopped at a stoplight and someone rolled down the window and said, why don't you go home? They would say that's anti-Semitism, right? But I'm just actually reading your bumper sticker, right? So there's a kind of unreflective way in which we kind of navigate that kind of allegiance, national allegiance, and navigate that dual allegiance that's complicated and very often not really very well thought out.
Yeah, so I want to go back to what you said, because I think what you find in the United States with critique of Israel or negation of the current Israeli government and so on, and people jumping to defend Israel, its government, because they fear their own identity, as Shaul suggests. It's quite similar to what you see in Europe, at least those communities I'm familiar with. But I think what you see or what you have there is much more of what Steve was talking about, namely a clear sense of hate, like a blanketing hate of everything that involves Jews living in Israel, not just the state of Israel, its government, but really the entire entity, sure. The language, the culture, the people, and that kind of a blanket hate, I think, goes well beyond what we call here a negation. So I think as we are discussing, possibilities of criticizing certain elements of Israeli politics or certain shades and colors of Zionism, I think it's almost impossible to refute the fact that some of the critique leveled at Israel as a state, and some of the critique leveled at Israel's government, certainly some of the critique leveled at Zionism in its plural form, is based in clear, pure hate. And this hate goes well beyond the current policy of the Israeli government or the Israeli government's post-1967. It's hate of the worst kind. And I think that as we're being critical about what's going on, we should not for a second undermine the fact that this hate is alive and it's viable and it's deadly. People are attacked because they wear yarmulke, in certain places in Europe, or they will not wear their kippah because they know that if they wear it, they'll get attacked. So hate is something we have to grapple with, just as we have to grapple with political circumstances in Israel and the Middle East.
We have about 5 more minutes before 5 to 7 more minutes, 5 minutes actually. So I suggest I collect 4 questions, and then maybe that way we wrap it up with your comments. We go that way. So I have Gilad, you were on the, sorry, Gilad, Annie, Josh, and Elaine. Elaine, do you want to start? So we go.
I'll start. I am curious. Amir, you said something that really struck me. You said you don't want people to be detached. You want them to be caring and critical. But we don't get to be critical. That's the outside thing that you said. I agree that we should be caring and critical. That detachment from that large community of Jews, whatever you think about the politics, is a terrible idea. I look in the paper and see what happened to Jews all over the place. But you can't be critical, and that's the issue that I think you raised, that unless you that you say anything critical, like maybe they shouldn't have done it, and everybody's screaming at you, or you're set outside the boundaries. How do we solve that problem? You defined the problem beautifully, but how does it get fixed?
First of all, thank you very much for a really wonderful talk. Listening to what you're saying, the idea that you don't want people detached seems to come through very strong. And I was wondering that if we're going to be talking about a mindset in which Zion does still remain very important to Jewish identity, and I think it is, even many anti-Zionists I talk to, Zion remains very central to their Jewish identity. Is it so much non-Zionism we're talking about, or perhaps a better class of Zionism that we're talking about? That if, it seems to me, and perhaps in being utterly rose-tinted in my view of the past, that in recent decades, there seems to be a certain stagnation of Zionist thought. That if you look at the absolute multiplicity of Zionisms that exist prior to 1948, maybe even earlier than 1948, there is absolutely nothing like that today. That there is a very sort of base Zionism that dominates the conversation today. Should we be pushing for just a better type of Zionism, which is actually connected to the facts on the ground? To borrow a term from some of the fiercest critics of Zionism, that is interested in Doigkeit, in the here and the now, in the reality in which Jews live.
So I guess this is the generation gap you're describing, but for me it seems like totally self-evident that Zionism shouldn't be what marks you as either like a good American Jew or not. But it strikes me that like what you're describing in terms of Zionism needing deconstruction, right? Us all needing to recognize that Zionism from its outset has been conflicted. That's kind of what's happening with every identity category, every belief system I know of. I feel like what the message that my generation gets over and over again is like, feminism isn't one thing, like the Democratic Party used to be bad, right? I feel like all we're given over and over again is this belief that actually no party is what we actually think it is, and that these things are constantly changing. And as I'm sure you know, like Judith Butler's solution to this problem is actually just to surrender labels altogether and make everything issue-centric, right? That the labels are always going to reify the categories that they're claiming to protect. Do you think that's the solution, or like what do you think we should do about the fact that we all already are disillusioned about the utility of labels to begin with?
So one thing that struck me about the talk, you mentioned how post-Zionism is essentially a secular movement in Israel, and I think that's right. I mean, I'm a secular Jew. That's how I identify myself, and I can identify with the ideas and the concept that post-Zionism talks about. But your talk, which I found very interesting and very engaging is essentially more centered on spiritual and religious ideas. So I'm wondering how you think, if it's at all possible, to translate those ideas that are spiritual, so that they could be found appealing by people who are secular Jews, who are in, maybe have some more, I don't know, heritage-based connection to Judaism, or tradition-based. I'm not sure how to call it exactly, but do not necessarily identify with the more religious aspects of it, or belief-based aspects of it.
Right.
So those were all rather small questions.
So maybe there's a way to tie at least some of the questions together, starting with the first one. How do you deal with criticism? So you express criticism and then you're being attacked by, So my reply to this is to point to the many groups of activists and individuals I know of in Israel who are fighting and willing to risk a lot by going to demonstrations, by writing and so on, by putting themselves out there to fight for the kind of progressive, ethical causes that I think many of us here in this room care about. So obviously you'll get a lot of flack just as they do, but I think there's no other way but putting yourself out there and exposing yourself to potential criticism and then engaging, if possible, in a conversation, which I think goes back to the question of Zionism, which I think Josh raised. So what is Zion? Why is this, sort of poor or impoverished, Zionism that we see today? Well, I think that if you were to read, for example, contemporary Hebrew literature, you would find that some of the most interesting voices in Hebrew literature are thinking through literature and the arts, what it means to live as a Jewish polity in this space between the Jordan River and Palestine. So I think we need to expand our definitions, which takes me to Annie's point. Yes, I think thinking by topics and by issues is very helpful. For example, is the Israeli government now proposing an outrageous new law? So you fight that issue and you try to avoid thinking, okay, which party is in favor of what? So I'm all in favor of thinking topically, both in Israel and in this country, in terms of reacting to what's happening daily or weekly and so on.
Okay, I'll try very quickly. Well, on the critique question, I think there's a kind of practical approach, and I think that Amir really gave a good answer in terms of the more, I think, substantive approach. I think it would be interesting to bring into the conversation that for a younger generation, if they can't critique Israel, they will detach, because they don't have that romantic connection. Right. So if critique is not opened up as a possibility as part of the conversation, that's the choices that they will eventually make, given one choice or the other. In terms of a better Zionism, I think that you're right. I think one of the ways of doing it is to actually become more conversant in the complex conversation of Zionism, and to ask the question, why is Jabotinsky a Zionist and Martin Buber not a Zionist? As just to throw out names, right? I mean, that in a way, I think it's very disarming for the Israel advocacy community when they're confronted with Zionist positions that they never knew existed, and that actually are kind of counterintuitive to their whole understanding. So it's really the way to actually broaden the conversation is actually to talk about Zionism, right? In terms of the labels thing, I mean, I think you're right. I also just want to throw out that why is it somehow a lesser Jewish identity for someone to say, I'm very Jewishly engaged in all kinds of different ways. I don't care about Israel. Like it's not that I'm against it. It's like it's not part of my Jewish existence, right? Almost half the Jews in the world live in the United States, and most Israelis could care less about American Jewry. So it's not only a question about where Jews live. Jews live in both places, almost equally. Yet Israelis learn almost nothing. The Israelis know much more about 19th century Poland than they know about 21st century American Jewry, right? And there's reasons for that. There are educational choices that are made for that reason, because they don't want them to move to America, right? Which they do anyway.
They come from here, there, from the Jewish community.
Well, the financial thing.
You didn't touch it.
Yeah, it's
it's like so important. I'm sorry.
That is a very important issue, right?
But this is it.
It's also, I just want to insist, because I think it's also.
People, I mean, it would not happen.
Well, but I want to respond to that very quickly. That I think that we have been taught through the education that we have that we are somehow second-class citizens by being American Jews. So Amos Oz gets up at the GA some years ago to give a talk, and he says, "We in Israel are actors on the stage. You American Jews are the audience." And what was so striking about that comment was that no one in the audience protested that, right? In other words, that's kind of we have been indoctrinated is too strong a word. We have been educated that somehow we exist in order to support, and here comes the money, right? We is to support either with our wallets or checkbooks or with our words, and yet almost half of world Jewry lives in the United States, and I don't necessarily feel like my existence. I mean, I happen to be an Israeli citizen. I lived in Israel for over 10 years, but I don't feel like my Jewish existence is dependent on or should be dependent on a place where I choose not to live. It should be dependent on a place where I choose to live. Right? And so
look, just to know, do you remember the last line in Philip Roth's Goodbye Columbus? I think the last line is, "Now let us begin."
Right.
So this is the first of a series of discussions. We're not going to talk about everything. And but we'll talk about a lot. And we did today. Charlotte, do you want to close?
That was
very good.
such a graceful way to conclude. So I just want to thank both of you.